Thank you all for coming this evening. This is a continuation of the World Disorder series. We didn't want to let you down, so we've created a certain disorder for this evening. I'm the Kennan Professor, and it's my pleasure to introduce Bill Browder, who has a marked figure in Russia, in Putin's Russia, because he became a major investor in Russia in the 1990s, where there was a great deal of money to be made. And he fairly soon found out the consequences of being a marked man in that situation, but I don't want to anticipate the lecture. I would like to thank the Cabot Corporation and our former trustee, Mr. Ronaldo Schmitz, for contributing the money to make all this possible. And I would point out that Bill Browder's book has been very well reviewed, Red Notice, and is well worth, it's a fairly hair-raising book not to be read in the evenings. Anyway, I'll leave it to him. I don't want to anticipate anything. He may run to 45 minutes. Then we'll take questions. Please only ask one question. Please don't deliver a monologue, much as we'd like to see it. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I think there's some people here in the audience who think that they're coming to hear a mathematician because there's another Bill Browder, who is my uncle, who's actually here in the audience, who's a professor of mathematics, and they thought, how interesting to hear a mathematician talk about how he's Putin's #1 enemy. But it's not that Bill Browder. It's me. A lot of people, when they hear me open my mouth and hear my American accent, they ask themselves, how did this guy with an American accent end up in such a mess in Russia? And so I want to tell you my story. I am indeed American. I was actually born here in Princeton, New Jersey. In fact, my father was here at the Institute of Advanced Studies when I was born, so I have an even deeper connection to here specifically. I grew up in Chicago, but I come from a very unusual American family. My grandfather, Earl Browder, was a labor union organizer from Wichita, Kansas. And he was so good at organizing the union that he was eventually approached by the communists, who said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come to Russia to check it out? So Earl went to Moscow in 1927, and he did what most young American men do when they arrive in Moscow. He found himself a Russian girl who became my grandmother, and my father was born in Moscow. The family then moved back to America 5 years later in 1932, and Earl became the head of the American Communist Party for the next 13 years. He ran for president on the communist ticket against Roosevelt in 1936 and 1940. He was imprisoned in 1941, pardoned in 42, expelled from the Communist Party in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist, and then persecuted in the 1950s during the McCarthy era for being a communist. That is my family legacy. I was born in 1964. When I was going through my teenage rebellion, I was trying to figure out how I could rebel from this family of communists. And I tried out various things. I grew my hair long. It grew into an afro. But that didn't seem to upset my family. It only caused my father to blame my baldness to this day to my hairstyle. I followed the Grateful Dead around for several months. That also didn't cause any grief. But then I figured out the perfect way to upset my family, which was to put a suit and tie on and become a capitalist. So I became a capitalist, and I enrolled in Stanford Business School in 1987, and I graduated Stanford in 1989. And 1989 was a very auspicious year because that was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was finishing up business school, trying to figure out what to do with my life, I couldn't get excited by any of the things that were being offered on campus. All the traditional jobs for MBAs just didn't resonate with me. And as I was going to more and more unsuccessful job interviews and uninspiring company presentations, one day I had this epiphany, which was that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to set out to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And so that's what I set out to do. I moved to London at first because there was nothing going on specifically in Eastern Europe that I could do at the time. And I ended up getting a job at Salomon Brothers, which doesn't exist anymore, but is a very famous investment bank that many of you will remember, made infamous by the book Liar's Poker. So I ended up at Salomon Brothers on the East European investment banking team. And my first assignment was to advise a fishing fleet located in Murmansk, which is located a couple hundred miles north of the Arctic Circle, on their privatization. So I take a plane from London to St. Petersburg. I change planes in the middle of the night, and I take another plane straight north to Murmansk. I arrive very, very early in the morning the next day in Murmansk, and the head of the fishing fleet comes to the airport to pick me up. And before we go to the corporate offices, he tells me he wants to take me down to the docks so I can see one of their boats. So we go down to the docks, and he shows me one of these fishing vessels, and it was a remarkably large boat. It was about 300 feet long. It was on 5 different levels. At the very top level, they had the nets which caught the fish. Then they would put all the stuff from the nets into a chute that goes down to the next level, and they would separate out the fish from the other stuff that they picked up in their nets. And then the fish would go down to the next level and go into various machines, and they would actually can the fish in the boat on the water. And so these are effectively ocean-going factories. And I asked him, how much does one of these things cost? And he said, $20 million. And then I asked him, how many do you have in your fleet? And he said, 100. So I did the math. 20 million times 100 gets you to $2 billion worth of ships. And I'm not an expert on ships, but I asked him, what is the average age of your fleet? And he said 7 years. And so I figured 7 years, they're probably half depreciated, so about $1 billion worth of ships. And I had been hired by this company to advise the management on whether or not they should exercise their legitimate right under the privatization program to buy 51% of this company. And so then I asked him, at what price can you buy 51% of this company? And he said, $2.5 million. So let me just repeat the math for you. So there's $1 billion worth of ships, and they can buy 51% for $2.5 million. Now, you don't have to be a Stanford MBA to know that that's a good deal. So after the end of this several days in Murmansk, I was supposed to fly back to London, but I thought to myself, this is unbelievable. Is this a fishing anomaly or just a situation with this particular company, or is this going on all over Russia? So instead of flying back to London, I decided I was going to go to Moscow and find out what was going on. So I take a plane from Murmansk to Moscow, and I should point out that I don't speak a word of Russian, and I don't know a single person in Russia other than the head of this fishing fleet. And so I arrive at Sheremetyevo Airport, and I don't even know what I'm going to do, but I need to figure this out. And so I'm walking through the airport. I noticed there was a kiosk, and in the kiosk they're selling an English language yellow page directory. And so I buy this English language yellow page directory. I take a taxi to the Metropole Hotel, and the next morning I start cold calling people in the directory to see if they'll meet with me to explain to me what's going on with the privatization program. So over the course of the week, I had about 40 meetings, and by the end of the week, I was able to conclude definitively that the Russian privatization program at that point in time was the single most compelling investment opportunity that has ever existed or will ever exist in the history of financial markets. And what I learned was the following, that when in order to go from communism to capitalism, which is what they decided to do at this point, they understood that if they just declared themselves capitalists, that would mean nothing. And so they wanted to create capitalists. And to create capitalists, the way they decided to do it was to transfer all the state property from the state into the hands of the people, so they would all be capitalists. And so the way that they chose to do this, one of several ways they chose to do this, was something called voucher privatization. And the voucher privatization was very straightforward. They gave a voucher, a physical certificate, to every person in the country. And those physical certificates were like cash. You could hold it, you could sell it, you could trade it, you could submit it for privatizations. You could do anything you wanted with it. And so there's 150 million of these things in circulation. And a secondary market developed for these vouchers, and they traded for about $20 each. And so again, I did the simple math. $20 times 150 million gets you to $3 billion. And these $3 billion worth of vouchers were exchangeable for 30% of all the share capital of all Russian companies, which meant that the market value of the entire country of Russia in 1992 was $10 billion. And just to put this into some perspective for you, this is a country with 35% of the world's natural gas, 10% of the world's oil, 10% of the world's aluminum, 10% of the world's steel. There's fertilizer, timber, electricity companies, telephone companies, banks, car companies, etc., all combined for a value of $10 billion. That's like a 99.99% discount to the value of comparable companies in the West. It was like they were giving bars of gold away for free on the streets. So I get back to, I couldn't believe that I just come across this, and I thought, my God, this is how fortunate am I to have found this out. And so I get back to London, I rush up the escalator at Salomon Brothers, I go to the first person who I see, and I say, we've just got to stop everything else we're doing and invest in Russia. And before I had a chance to even explain, he looked at me like, what, are you completely out of your mind? Who are you? Invest in Russia? And I didn't even have a chance to get any other information into the conversation. He completely shut down. Now, I didn't have any particular sort of organizational social skills. And so I figured if one person said no, I'm just going to go to the next person. So I went to the next person. I said, we got to stop everything we're doing, et cetera. And again, the same thing happened. And pretty soon, I'd gone to every important person in the firm and completely discredited myself. Nobody took me at all seriously or even listened to what I had to say. I used to hang around with a bunch of young guys in the mid-20s who we'd go out to lunches and drinks after work, and they stopped inviting me for lunches and drinks because nobody wanted to ruin their career being associated with this crazy guy who couldn't shut up about Russia. And so I was not only sort of ridiculed and disliked, but more to the point, at Salomon Brothers, I wasn't making any money for the firm. And so I was really, after about a year, on the verge of being fired. They don't keep around dead wood. And I was very upset about being fired, first of all, but even more importantly, not being able to explore and express this clear economic opportunity that I've discovered in Russia. And so I'm sitting there pondering what I'm going to do, how I'm going to fix this problem. And one day, my phone rings in London, and it's a very senior partner from the New York office of Salomon Brothers, who says, Bill, I hear that you are having some career problems, but you might have something interesting to say about Russia. Can you come to New York and explain it to me? So I said, yes, of course. So I make an appointment at the end of the week. I sit up 3 nights in a row putting together the most persuasive presentation I can muster. I take a flight to New York. I go to the Salomon Brothers office. I sit down in the conference room, and I start taking him through the presentation. And this was a very strange man, this one. He was one of these people that doesn't have any social skills. And so I was getting no response when I was going through the presentation. I was flipping through this PowerPoint, and I got to page 20, and there was no uh-huhs or nodding of his head or any type of indication of whether I was communicating with him or getting through to him. And after about page 20, without saying a word, he just gets up and leaves the room. And this was my one opportunity to save myself, and I couldn't figure out what I had done wrong. I thought I had a good presentation. I thought I had a good delivery, but I clearly didn't because the guy just got up and left the room. And I was determined to fix this thing when he comes back because I couldn't afford to mess this meeting up. And I'm going over in my mind what I could do differently, what I did wrong, how I could fix this. And 10 minutes goes by, and he's still not back. And then 20 minutes goes by, 30, 40. 52 minutes later, he comes back into the room, and I'm about to blurt something out to try to correct this meeting. But before I have a chance to say a single word, he sits down very calmly and says, Bill, those first 20 pages you just showed me are so compelling that I just went to the risk management committee of Salomon Brothers and got you $25 million to invest. So all of a sudden, all of my worldly problems have completely disappeared. I got my money to invest in Russia. I go to Russia. I'm the very first foreign investor in the country. We buy up these vouchers. We submit them for shares of companies. We put together this portfolio. And then 7 months later, The Economist magazine writes an article called Sale of the Century. And in this article, they just repeat the math that I've just told you. And because of that, like 20 people showed up trying to buy Russian stocks. And this is the Russian stock market at the time was an extremely illiquid, thinly traded market. And if you get 20 Westerners showing up all at once wanting to buy stocks, it did one thing, which it pushed up the value of our portfolio 500%. The portfolio went from 25 million to 125 million in a matter of 3 weeks. Now, this is back in the days when $100 million was real money. And so all of a sudden, I was a hero on the trading floor of Salomon Brothers. So all the guys who had ignored me for lunches and drinks were hanging out my desk in the morning wanting to get tips on how to make 5 times their money on the Russian stock market. And then the most interesting thing happened, which was that the most senior people at the firm who covered the accounts of people like George Soros and others started coming by my desk and saying, Bill, I know you're busy and you've got really important things going on, but is there any chance you could spare half an hour to explain this stuff to George Soros? He'd be so grateful. Sir John, the guy who covered Sir John Templeton, Bill, I know you got, that really you don't want to be dealing with any other things right now, but Sir John Templeton would be so grateful if you could spend an hour with him. I was getting an invitation from every single person from the royalty of Wall Street to come explain them what was going on in Russia. So I go on this world tour of famous people on Wall Street. And after each presentation, they're not nearly as stupid as my Salomon Brothers colleagues. After each presentation, they said, wow, this is amazing. We want in. Can we give you some money to manage? And at the time, we were just managing money for ourselves. We weren't doing it for other people. So I said, I don't know. Let me go back and ask the bosses. So I go back to the trading floor of Salomon Brothers, and I go to the corner of the trading floor where the boss sat, and I walk in and I say, George Soros and a bunch of others would like us to invest their money for them in Russia. What do you think? And this time he said, that's a genius idea, Bill. Let's form a task force to study it. So I show up at the first task force meeting is the following Friday. I show up at this meeting. I walk into a room, and there's 45 people in this room. 40 of them I've never seen before in my life. There was the vice chairman of the firm. There was senior managing directors, senior directors, senior vice presidents, and then me. And so we all sit down, and then the discussion begins. And pretty quickly, it turns from a discussion into a heated argument, where each of the different groups of people inside the firm were arguing about who should get the economic credit for the business. And there's one thing for sure that I've learned about investment bankers is they're extremely good at arguing for money that they don't deserve. And so I wasn't sure who was going to win this argument, but they were all so persuasive. But I was absolutely sure of who wasn't going to get any economic credit for the business. And that was going to be me. And so I got really upset. I was the only person in this entire room of 45 people who had ever even been to Russia, and they were all trying to steal the stuff away from me. And so after about 3 nights of not being able to sleep, I walked into the head of the trading floor with my ID card. I slapped it on his table, and I told him I quit. I'm going to set up my own investment fund in Russia. So I quit. I set up my own investment fund in Russia. I call it Hermitage Capital Management. One of those famous Wall Street people, a man named Edmund Safra, who was the owner of Republic National Bank of New York, gave me $25 million to invest. I invested it, and it could not have gone any better. In the first 18 months of my fund, the portfolio went up 850%. I was the best performing fund manager in the world in 1997. The assets grew from 25 million to more than $1 billion. I was featured on the front page of the business section of the New York Times and Time Magazine, Business Week. My clients were sending me their private jets to take me to their yachts to celebrate my financial genius. And I was all of 31 years old. Now, any of these things would have been great accomplishments individually. But if you take them all together and you put them into the hands of a 31-year-old, that is the biggest sell signal that there ever was. But of course, I was 31 years old, and so I had no idea of that. And so I thought that my $1 billion was going to turn into 10. It didn't quite work out that way, though. In 1998, in August of 1998, the Asian currency started to devalue. It led to pressure on the Russian bond market. And in August 18th, 2008, 1998, the Russian government defaulted on their bonds, devalued the currency by 75%, and instead of my billion turning into 10 billion, my billion turned into 100 million. I lost $900 million. There were no more invitations to the yachts after that. But more importantly, I had enthusiastically and very sincerely persuaded people to invest in Russia with this pitch that this was going to be a great economic opportunity, and I had completely gotten it wrong, and gotten it wrong for so many people. And I felt very responsible and very bad about that. And I wanted to do something to fix it. And so I decided I was going to do whatever I had to do to make their money back. Now, in theory, it shouldn't have been all that hard to make the money back, because after a big devaluation in a country like Russia, where most of the companies are oil companies, the costs go down, the revenues stay the same, and the profits explode. And so it should have all gone back to where it was, except for the fact that these companies were owned by oligarchs. And the oligarchs, up until 1998, had kind of behaved themselves, because investment bankers from Wall Street had all come to them and said, if you behave yourself, we can get you some free money on Wall Street. And so these people, these oligarchs who were genuinely not very honest and nice people, thought to themselves, well, we can always steal later once we've got that free money from Wall Street, so why don't we just behave ourselves and get that money first? Long-term greedy. So up until 1998, they behaved themselves, but then after the market crashed, there was nobody giving any money to Russians on for any reason from Wall Street, and so there was no longer any incentive for them to behave themselves. And in Russia, there is no disincentive to misbehaving. And so if you're a profit-maximizing oligarch with no morals, what do? You steal everything that you possibly can. And these oligarchs embarked on an orgy of stealing, which has been unprecedented in the history of business. They were doing asset stripping, dilutions, embezzlement, transfer pricing, and taking all of these illegal concepts and making them a high art in terms of how they were going about doing this. And they were effectively going to steal the last 10 cents of the dollar that I had left, that I was supposed to be using as the base for getting my clients out of this mess. And so as a matter of necessity, I became an anti-corruption fighter in Russia. Now, the most famous case of fighting corruption in Russia was a company that you've all heard of called Gazprom. Gazprom in 1999 was trading at a 99.7% discount per barrel of hydrocarbon reserves to Exxon and BP. Why was it trading so cheaply? It was trading so cheaply because everybody thought that all hydrocarbon reserves had been stolen out of the company. Now, I wasn't sure whether they had or they had not, but I figure if I'm going to fight this, the first thing I need to do is actually figure out what's been stolen, to do a stealing analysis. So how do you do a stealing analysis of a Russian company? This was not a class they taught at Stanford Business School. You couldn't go to the management of the company and say, excuse me, sir, can you tell me how much you're stealing? Nor could you go to the investment banks that cover these companies and do research on these companies, because they have their nose so firmly up the backside of the management of Gazprom, hoping that some small amount of money will find their way to them. So I decided to do something unique, which was to make a list of those people who knew about the stealing at Gazprom, competitors, customers, ex-employees, suppliers, etc., and ask them to a meal. I made a list of 40 people and invited them to breakfast, lunch, dinner, tea, coffee, etc., to ask them about the stealing. And I didn't tell them my agenda in advance. I just asked them, and most people were curious what this guy was doing, so they accepted. And I went to my first lunch, and I discovered the most interesting cultural anomaly about the Russians at this lunch. During the Soviet times, the richest person in Russia was 6 times richer than the poorest person. You might have had a bigger apartment, a dacha, maybe a car and a driver if you were in the Politburo. By 1999, the richest person in Russia was 250,000 times richer than the poorest person. And this disparity of wealth was created over a 10-year period. And it poisoned the psychology of the entire country. And so when I sat down to lunch with this first guy, he wasn't being cagey or keeping all this stuff to himself. He was so angry that he just started blurting out all these amazing stories. And I was just taking notes, writing it all down, flipping the page, writing it down. I had to leave the lunch. I had to stop him from talking to leave the lunch after about 2 hours and 15 minutes because I had to go somewhere. He could have talked all day. And every other meeting was exactly the same. And after having a couple dozen of these meetings, I filled up 2 full notebooks with the most outrageous stories of stealing you could ever imagine. The only problem with all this is I had no idea if any of this stuff was true. It could have just been completely made up, exaggerated, God knows what, sour grapes. And so it was very interesting and it was very fun and I had a lot of good stories to tell. But what am I going to do with this? How can I fight corruption on the basis of a bunch of rumors and anecdotes? And I was kind of struggling with this for a few weeks, and then we had this unbelievable lucky break. I have this guy working for me who's still with me now. His name is Vadim. He's a PhD economist from a top Moscow university, and he was my analyst. And he was driving down the street in Moscow, and he came to Pushkin Square, which is a place where the traffic snarls up very badly. And you could get stuck there from anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour, depending on what time of day and how bad the traffic is. And because of that, an outdoor market has emerged with street urchins selling stuff to the cars who are stuck in the traffic jam. And so one of the kids comes up to Vadim's window and bangs on it. And he says, and Vadim rolls down the window, and he says, "What do you got?" And the kid says, "Databases." And he said, "Databases?" And so he has a down parka, and he opens it up, and there's he has these translucent folders with disks in them. And so Vadim points towards one of the disks and says, "What's that?" And he says, "That's the Moscow Registration Chamber database. This is something we had been looking for, which has the registered ownership of all Moscow-based companies." And so Vadim said, "Well, how much?" $5. So he buys it. He comes back into the office and he says, "Some kid claims he just sold me the Moscow Registration Chamber database." And this is back in the days before computer viruses. So we pop it into the computer and fire it up. And sure enough, it's the Moscow Registration Chamber database with all bells and whistles showing beneficial ownership of all Russian companies. But the most importantly, on the front of the disk is a telephone number you can call for all the other databases. And so we got the Customs Committee database, we got the Federal Securities Commission database, and various other ones. And from these databases, we could now go back to these notes that we had and verify what was what. And we discovered the most unbelievable economic statistic I've ever seen in my life, which was that between 1996 and 1999, 9 members of Gazprom management had stolen oil and gas reserves equal to the size of Kuwait. As you may remember, we fought a war over oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait in Kuwait. This had just happened in Russia, and nobody even knew it. That was the first most impressive economic statistic. The second most impressive economic statistic, and one that was much more actionable for me, was that oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait only represented 9.65% of Gazprom's total reserves. So in other words, more than 90% of the reserves of Gazprom have not been stolen. So remember, the company is trading at a 99.7% discount because everybody has assumed that everything is stolen. And we've proved analytically and factually that more than 90% is still there. Now, as an investor, when you see that type of crazy disparity between perception and reality, what do? Well, to use a highly technical financial term, we backed up the truck and bought as much Gazprom as we could get our hands on. Now, that's normally where you stop as an investor. You find something that people don't know, you prove it to yourself, you then position yourself, and you wait for the world to figure it out. But I was too impatient to wait for the world to figure it out on its own, and so I decided to take my dossier and break it into 7 chapters, and I gave the first chapter to the New York Times, the second to the Financial Times, the third to the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, Washington Post, etc. And each of them, they were so delighted, these journalists, I saved them 3 months worth of work. Each of them wrote a story, and then on the back of their stories, then 50 Russian journalists wrote stories. On the back of their stories, the Russian State Duma, the parliament, began debates on whether it was a good thing or bad thing for management to have stolen these assets. More stories. After that, the management of Gazprom hired PricewaterhouseCoopers to write a report to say it was a good thing to steal these assets. More stories. And in the end, there were 500 stories written about the theft of Gazprom that was generated off the back of our research. And then the most unbelievable thing happened, totally unexpected, which is that Vladimir Putin, who had just come to power, stepped into the fray at the annual general meeting of Gazprom. And he stepped in and he fired the CEO of Gazprom and replaced him with somebody whose job it was not to steal assets of Gazprom. And I say assets of Gazprom. He was allowed to steal other things. So this new man steps in, makes this announcement, and the share price on the day after goes up 138%. And then the share price doubled again, and doubled again after that, doubled again after that, doubled again, doubled again, and doubled again. In total, the share price of Gazprom between 1999 and 2005 went up 100 times. This was my largest investment. You can imagine I felt pretty good about myself. And I thought, if you can do this at Gazprom, why not do it somewhere else? And so we did the same thing at the electricity company, did the same thing at the National Savings Bank, did the same thing at several oil companies, et cetera, et cetera. Amazingly, I had this crazy confluence of interests with Vladimir Putin. I've never met the man. I have never spoken to him. But while I was doing this, fighting the guys who were stealing money from me, he was fighting the same guys who were stealing power from him. When he was elected president, he was effectively elected president of the presidential administration of Russia. The power of the presidency had mostly been stolen by the oligarchs. And so every time I would publicize a scandal, there's this expression, your enemy's enemy is your friend, Putin would step in and do something about the scandal. And so as a result of Gazprom plus all these other situations and Putin's intervention, the value of my portfolio went from 100 million to 4.5 billion. I became the largest foreign investor in Russia. And not only was I making money hand over fist for my clients and for myself, but better than that, we were having just the best time in the world getting the bad guys. There's nothing more satisfying than getting the bad guys. And so I had the perfect job where I could make money and do good in the same job. Very rare that you can have a job like that. You can either make money and not do good, or you can do good and not make money. But to have a job doing both is pretty remarkable. But of course, it was such a blessed job and a great situation, it couldn't have lasted forever. And it didn't last forever. In October of 2003, Putin finally decided to go for the jugular and win his war with the oligarchs. And the way he went about it was to arrest the richest man in Russia, a man named Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos Oil Company. Arrested him off his plane, parked on the runway in Siberia, put him on trial, put him in a cage, and then allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. Now imagine you're the 17th richest man in Russia. You see the richest man in the country sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction going to be? You don't want to sit in that cage. And so one by one, these people all went to Putin in the fall of 2004 and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage? And he said, it's very straightforward, 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government, not 50% for the presidential administration of Russia, 50% for Vladimir Putin. From that moment on, he became the richest man in Russia and the richest man in the world, I believe. And from that moment on, I was no longer exposing his enemies' financial shenanigans. I was exposing his own financial shenanigans. And because of that, you can imagine that my situation in Russia was not so favorable anymore. I learned about it very abruptly in November of 2005. I was on a weekend trip to London. I was flying back to Moscow. I arrive at Sheremetyevo Airport. I go to the VIP lounge, expecting to have my passport processed in 2 minutes. I'm there an hour later, still no passport processed. And then 4 guards bust into the lounge, grab me, take me down to the detention center of the airport, keep me locked up overnight. I don't know whether I'm being arrested or deported. And then the next morning, put me onto an airplane and send me back to London. I arrive in London, and we receive a notice from the Foreign Ministry of Russia, who have declared me a threat to national security, not to be allowed back into Russia. That was pretty devastating, but I understood that when the Russian government turns on you, they don't tend to do so mildly. They tend to do so with extreme prejudice. And I knew that wasn't going to be the end of my problems. And I looked at where I was exposed, and I was exposed in 2 areas. I was exposed that I had people in Russia, and I was exposed in that I had assets in Russia. And so I evacuated my staff, and we quickly and quietly sold every last security we had in Russia and got everything out, money and people, safe and sound. The only thing I kept in Russia was the lease on my office and 1 secretary in case the whole problem eventually blew over. So I started a new business investing elsewhere in the world. I forget about Russia, but unfortunately they didn't forget about me. On June 4th, 2007, 18 months after I was expelled from Russia, I get a call from the secretary in my little office who tells me that there's 25 police officers in the office, raiding the office, turning it upside down, looking for documents. I then call my American lawyer in Moscow to tell him my office is being raided by 25 officers, and he said, my office is being raided by 25 officers looking for your documents as well. They seized the documents for our investment holding companies, through which we had invested all this money, at my law firm's office. And then the next thing we know, we no longer own our investment holding companies. They have been fraudulently re-registered using the documents seized by the police, registered into the name of a man who had been convicted of murder and let out of jail early by the police to put his name on these documents. So at this point, I am absolutely terrified, not for economic reasons, because I don't have any money there, but I'm terrified if the police are cooperating with murderers to steal our companies, God knows what other bad things they're going to be doing legally. I need to get a good lawyer. So I look around, and I end up hiring the smartest lawyer in Moscow, a young man named Sergei Magnitsky. He was a 35-year-old lawyer, worked for an American law firm, and he was the kind of person who could do 10 things in the time it took other lawyers to do 1. He was just that much better and smarter than everybody else. And I said to him, figure out what these guys are trying to do, and let's stop it. And so he goes out and does an immense amount of research and comes back, and he says, I figured out what they're trying to do. Their scam was 2-pronged. The first part of their scam was to steal your money, but because you took it out, they didn't succeed in that part. He said, however, the second part they did succeed in. And the second part was that when we were taking all of our money out of Russia, when we were liquidating all of our shares, we had a profit of $1 billion. And we paid to the Russian government a capital gains tax bill of $230 million. And what Sergei had learned, what he had discovered, was that the people who stole our companies went back to the tax authorities and said there was a mistake made last year in the tax filing. The companies didn't make $1 billion and therefore shouldn't have paid $230 million of tax. That was paid in error. And they said, we'd like that money back. They applied for a $230 million tax refund on the 23rd of December, 2007, 2 days before Christmas. And the refund was approved and paid out the next day, on Christmas Eve. The largest tax refund in the history of Russia paid out in 1 day on a fraud. This wasn't our money that they were stealing. They were stealing the Russian government's money. Now, I had always thought of Putin as being a nationalist. I'm sure many of you continue to think that he's a nationalist. And so I thought, there's no way he would allow, he might allow his officials to steal from a foreigner, but to steal from the Russian government, no way. And we figured if we just make everybody aware of this, then the good guys will get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. So we wrote criminal complaints to every different branch of the Russian justice system. I went to all the newspapers, and then Sergei, my lawyer, went to the Russian State Investigative Committee, which is the equivalent of the FBI, in Russia and gave sworn testimony against the police officers who conducted the raids. And we sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. Well, it turned out that in the Putin regime, there are no good guys, only bad guys. Instead of going after the people who stole the money, on November 24th, 2008, the same officers who Sergei testified against came to his home at 8 in the morning and arrested him and put him in pretrial detention, where he was then tortured to retract his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They moved him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. And the purpose of this was to get him to withdraw his testimony and then to get him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million and he did so on my instruction. Now, I don't know how I would behave in a situation under this type of duress. I think if you had asked Sergei before he was arrested how he'd behave, he wouldn't be able to tell you. But when he was faced with the prospect of bearing false witness and perjuring himself, for him, the moral pain of that was more significant than the physical pain he was suffering, and he just refused to do what they asked him to do. And people don't refuse. They just don't. It's totally unusual. And so they just kept on ratcheting up the pressure, ratcheting up the torture. And after about 6 months of this, his health started to seriously deteriorate. He ended up developing terrible pains in his stomach, losing 40 pounds, and being diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones, and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. A week before his scheduled operation, they came to him again asked him to sign a false confession, and again he refused. And in retaliation for that, they abruptly moved him from a prison that had medical facilities to a maximum security prison called Butyrka, which is famous in Russia for being one of the most horrific KGB prisons in the country. And most significantly for Sergei, there were no medical facilities there. At Butyrka, his health went into a complete downward spiral. He went into constant, agonizing, ear-piercing pain, untreated. It got worse and worse. He and his lawyers desperately wrote 20 different requests for medical attention to every different branch of the justice system. And every different branch of the justice system either ignored or in some cases denied in writing his requests for medical attention. On the night of November 16th, 2009, his body could no longer take it anymore, and he went in critical condition. On that night, the authorities at Butyrka didn't want to have responsibility for him. And so they put him in an ambulance and sent him to the prison that had a medical wing. But when he arrived at that prison, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell, they chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him to death. That was 7 years ago. Sergei Magnitsky was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the telephone call at 7:45 a.m. the next morning that Sergei Magnitsky had been murdered. It was like a knife going right into my heart. It was the most terrifying, soul-destroying, traumatic piece of information I could have ever gotten. And when I finally calmed down from the hysteria to look at the situation, it became clear to me that there's only one thing I could do going forward, one thing only, which was to spend my time, energy, and resources going after the people who killed him to make sure they face justice. And that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years. Now, in theory, it shouldn't have been that hard to get justice for him, for one very unusual reason. Sergei Magnitsky wrote down everything that happened to him. In his 358 days in detention, he wrote 450 complaints documenting who did what to him, where, how, when, and why. And because of that, and he would write these complaints up, and once a month he would take a stack of them, give them to his lawyer. His lawyer would file them, they would be ignored, and we would get copies of them. But because of that, we have the most well-documented, granular, detailed account of human rights abuse that's come out of Russia in the last 35 years. And this became a major international scandal, the death of the lawyer of the largest foreign investor in Russia. And so in theory, with all this evidence, they should have done something. I thought they had to do something. But But they didn't. Not even low-level or middle-level guys were prosecuted. Instead, Putin circled the wagons, exonerated every single person involved, gave special promotions and state honors to some of the people most complicit. And in the most shocking travesty of justice, 3 years after they murdered Sergei Magnitsky, they put him on trial in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. And they put me on trial as his co-defendant. They found us both guilty. They couldn't do anything more to Sergei since he was already killed. They sentenced me to 9 years in absentia. After that, and even before that, it became obvious that we're not going to get any justice in Russia. And so I said to myself, well, let's get justice outside of Russia. But how do you get justice outside of Russia? You can't prosecute people in Russia. You can't prosecute in America for a murder that took place in Russia. But this was a financial crime. These people killed Sergei to steal $230 million. And that money, they don't keep in Russia. They keep that money in the West. They keep it in New York and London and Geneva. They buy houses in Miami and south of France and English countryside. They send their kids to boarding school in Switzerland and their girlfriends on shopping trips to Milan. They love to take their money and travel with it and spend it and buy things. And so I came up with this idea, which was that's their weak spot. So I went to Washington, and I met with Senator Benjamin Cardin of Maryland, who's a liberal Democrat, and I met with Senator John McCain, who you all know. And I told them both the story, and I said, can we do something about this? Can we freeze their assets and ban their visas? And these guys said, yes, we can. Let's make a Magnitsky law. And so in October of 2010, these two senators co-sponsored the Sergei Magnitsky Act. And the moment they put it onto the books, all sorts of other victims started coming forward and saying, you've hit the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. Can you sanction the people who killed my husband, my father, my sister, my brother? After about 12 of these people came forward, these two senators realized they were onto something much bigger than just one case. They were onto the new technology for dealing with human rights abuse in Russia. So they added 65 words to the law to include all other gross human rights abusers. And this thing went viral through the Senate. We ended up picking up co-sponsors left, right, and center. And we ended up with 39 Senate co-sponsors before it went for a vote. And I should point out, this was at a time when President Obama had a policy called the reset with Russia. He basically wanted to reset relations with Russia. And he wanted to do everything possible to not have this thing happen because it was so upsetting to Putin for obvious reasons. And so he was trying to stop us. But one of the great things about this country is the separation of powers, that the legislative branch has a separate power to the executive branch. And this was not a partisan thing. It wasn't a Democrat-Republican thing. This was one thing in Washington that the Democrats and Republicans could actually agree on. And so when it finally went for a vote in the Senate in November of 2012, it passed 92-4. It passed 89% of the House of Representatives. And while Obama hated it, he was forced to sign it into law on December 14th, 2012. There are now 39 people on the Magnitsky list. They can't get visas to America. Their assets are frozen here if they have them here. But most significantly, their names are placed on something called the Federal OFAC Sanctions List. This is the list that the US Treasury compiles of bad guys. It includes ISIS and Al-Qaeda terrorists, Colombian drug cartel bosses, and the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. And there's not a single bank in the world that will do business with a person on the OFAC sanctions list, because nobody wants to be in violation of US Treasury sanctions. You cannot get a bank account. You can't even get a credit card if you're on that sanctions list. And so as a result, these people's their financial lives are effectively over. It's not the kind of punishment that I'd really like. I'd like to see prosecutions for torture and murder, but it's a heck of a lot better than total impunity, which is what they had been enjoying before. Now, I'm pleased to say that this idea didn't just stop with bad guys in Russia. These two senators realized that this is not just the technology for dealing with bad guys in Russia, this is the technology for dealing with bad guys everywhere. And so in 2013, they launched the Global Magnitsky Act. And I'm very proud to say that this afternoon, the Global Magnitsky Act passed the House of Representatives. We'll never be able to bring Sergei Magnitsky back, and that's a burden that I'm going to have to wear on my shoulders for the rest of my life. But in his name, in his legacy, we've created a process which creates a serious disincentive for people to do bad stuff everywhere in the world. And perhaps his death will save some lives going forward. Thank you very much.